She started as a maid in a millionaire's mansion, running from a painful past. He was the enigmatic boss, always surrounded by numbers and controversy. A night of confession and vulnerability forever changed the course of their lives. And then, 3 little hearts beat stronger, bringing hope where there had only been loneliness. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. Keisha stood outside the mansion's ornate iron gates, feeling a surge of anticipation and nerves all at once. The wrought iron swirls gleamed in the morning light, guarding a long, perfectly manicured driveway lined with tall hedges. She double-checked the paper in her hand, making sure she had come to the correct address. The Dawson estate. A job here meant hope, enough money to eventually help her grandparents with their medical needs. Clutching her small leather bag, she took a breath and rang the bell. The gates swung open with a low groan that seemed to signal the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter in her life. She walked slowly toward the main doors, unable to ignore the grandeur around her. A fountain at the center of the circular driveway sprayed gentle arcs of water, glistening in the sun. Small birds hopped around the trimmed hedges, as if they, too, were quietly watching her approach. Keisha exhaled, steeling herself for whatever lay behind the massive wooden doors. Inside, the echo of her footsteps on the marble floor was almost intimidating. A tall, stern-looking woman with pin-straight posture awaited her. "You must be Keisha," the woman said coolly. "I'm Mrs. Bancroft, the head housekeeper. Follow me." Keisha offered a polite greeting, but Mrs. Bancroft had already turned on her heel, striding across the gleaming foyer without looking back. The foyer spilled into a vast hallway decorated with gilded mirrors and intricate wallpaper. Portraits of past Dawsons peered down with a timeless seriousness. Mrs. Bancroft offered a clipped explanation of the day's schedule. Keisha's primary role would be assisting in the serving duties, setting tables, carrying trays, ensuring everything ran smoothly for the upcoming gatherings. The instructions came quickly, and Keisha's head spun trying to memorize each one. She could barely admire the luxurious setting, too anxious about making a good impression. They stepped through a swinging door into a bustling kitchen. The smell of fresh bread, roasting vegetables, and a hint of lemon polish enveloped Keisha in a comforting warmth. Stainless steel counters gleamed under bright lamps, and a tall, broad-shouldered woman in an apron turned to greet them with a gentle smile. "This is Mrs. Watts, the cook," Mrs. Bancroft announced. "She'll direct you when it comes to plating and basic prep." Mrs. Watts nodded at Keisha, offering a quick, friendly hello before turning back to a pot that threatened to bubble over. A moment later, a solemn man in a crisp black suit stepped in, glancing at Keisha with an appraising gaze. "This is Mr. Harris, our butler," Mrs. Bancroft said. Mr. Harris offered a curt nod, but said nothing. Keisha felt the weight of his scrutiny, as if he were silently evaluating every detail about her. She swallowed hard and tried to convey confidence, though she couldn't help noticing that his expression bordered on wary disapproval. The next minutes blurred by as she was whisked through the side halls into the guest wings, where she saw stately rooms in soft pastel tones, each with lavish bedspreads and vases of fresh flowers. She could only marvel at the sheer opulence. Thick carpeting muffled their steps, tall windows let in beams of sunlight, and every detail seemed deliberately placed for maximum elegance. Mrs. Bancroft explained that tonight there would be a small, informal dinner for a few friends of Mr. Dawson, followed by a larger charity event the next evening. Keisha's main responsibility was to assist with serving refreshments and ensure guests received whatever they requested. As they rounded a corner, a figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. He was tall, with poised confidence and a neatly tailored suit that fit like second skin. Keisha didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Richard Dawson. He was speaking with someone she didn't recognize, likely a business associate, his words quiet and measured. Suddenly, his glance shifted. Keisha felt herself tense. He nodded politely in her direction, his expression neutral, and then continued on his way. She barely had time to register the moment before Mrs. Bancroft's voice called her back to reality, reminding her that there was still much to learn. Keisha was led to a small room off the second-floor servant quarters, where she found the crisp uniform she would be required to wear, a white blouse, a black skirt just below the knee, and practical flat shoes. It wasn't exactly uncomfortable, but the stiff collar and the overall formality made her feel like she was putting on someone else's skin. She carefully donned it, smoothing out any wrinkles, determined not to give Mr. Harris or Mrs. Bancroft cause for complaint. Her first real task came soon enough, setting a large tray of cutlery and fine china in one of the dining rooms. Biting her lower lip, she began placing forks and knives in their assigned positions, recalling each specific step Mrs. Bancroft had recited. The tension caused her hands to tremble slightly. She nearly dropped a silver knife when Mr. Harris suddenly materialized behind her, questioning the angles of her placements. He corrected her posture, sternly pointing out the correct distance from the table's edge. Keisha apologized, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, but she refused to let the awkwardness break her spirit. She felt a rush of relief when, after a while, she slipped back into the kitchen to fetch more silverware. Mrs. Watts, the cook, was ladling soup into a large pot. Noticing Keisha's frazzled expression, she set aside her ladle and placed a gentle hand on the young woman's arm. "Don't mind Mr. Harris too much," she whispered kindly. "He's old-fashioned, set in his ways. He'll warm up to you if you prove yourself." Keisha mustered a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "I hope so." Mrs. Watts's kindness was like a balm amid the swirl of new responsibilities and watchful eyes, but that kindness didn't shield her from the stumbling blocks of the day. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Bancroft handed Keisha a tower of polished glass champagne flutes, instructing her to carry them to the smaller dining room. While navigating a corner, she accidentally bumped into the edge of a table and nearly sent the top glasses tumbling. Her heart pounded as the delicate stems clinked precariously. She managed to steady the tray in time, but not without emitting a sharp gasp that drew the attention of two other staff members. They merely exchanged knowing glances, whispering to one another after she'd gone. Wishing she could momentarily disappear, Keisha hurried down the corridor. She caught sight of multiple portrait paintings, Dawson ancestors, she presumed, observing her from the walls. Their painted eyes, stern and lifelike, seemed to challenge her presence in these hallowed halls. She shook off the uneasy sensation, reminding herself of why she was here. The pay was substantial, enough to help cover the mounting bills back home. She couldn't let a few stumbles deter her. Later, as the day wore on, she reached her assigned bedroom on the mansion's top floor, barely larger than a walk-in closet. Inside was a narrow cot, a small wooden dresser, and a single lamp on a plain nightstand. Setting her bag down, she allowed herself a sigh of both fatigue and relief. This simple space was her own, no matter how small, and it was all she needed to keep her hope alive. She pulled off her stiff black shoes, rubbing her sore feet, thinking of her grandparents far away and wishing she could check on them. Dusk arrived in a quiet hush. Outside her window, the sprawling lawn and gardens took on a dusky glow, and the silhouette of the mansion's columns stretched ominously across the grass. Feeling restless, Keisha decided to wander for a few minutes. She found herself drawn to the far west wing, where a dimly lit corridor led to a small balcony and, to her surprise, a cozy alcove resembling a hidden library. The hush inside was comforting, the shelves lined with imposing books and faint scents of old leather. She stepped inside, letting the day's stress slip away for just a moment. A soft cough made her jump. She spun around to find Mr. Harris stepping into the library behind her. His face was unreadable. "Exploring on your first day?" he asked in an even tone. Keisha swallowed, certain he'd scold her for being in an area she shouldn't. Instead, he only shook his head. "Just remember your responsibilities. This house needs everything to be in order. especially with the upcoming events. We can't have slip-ups." Keisha nodded, heart pounding, then hurried off to her room as the last streaks of sunset faded. Night settled over the Dawson estate. Keisha tried to relax on her cot, absently smoothing the crumpled edge of her blanket. She could still see the grand corridors in her mind, the expensive china, the piercing gaze of Mr. Harris, and the surprising gentleness of Mrs. Watts. She recalled the faint smile on Richard Dawson's face when he first glanced at her. Questions rushed in. Did he notice how awkward she'd felt? Did he sense she was determined to prove herself here, no matter how out of place she appeared? Exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, yet sleep wouldn't come easily. Finally, she forced herself to stand and peer out the narrow window. Beyond the courtyard, ornate lamps lit the mansion's exterior, and she could see the fountain still dancing in the moonlight. The day had been long, but it was only the beginning. So much of this place was still a mystery. Richard Dawson's private dealings, the swirl of upcoming events, and the unwritten judgments from certain members of the staff. She silently vowed to keep her composure and do her best, reminding herself that everything rested on maintaining this job and sending money back home. She turned off the lamp, letting the darkness of the room embrace her for a moment. Just as she exhaled, there was a subtle shift of light in the hallway. Startled, she stepped forward to peek through the slightly open door. At the end of the corridor, the figure of Richard stood in partial shadow. He seemed to be watching her door, his expression contemplative, almost curious. Their eyes met. She wasn't sure if he could see her clearly, but the moment felt charged with unspoken questions. Then, as though someone had called him from around the corner, he pivoted and vanished. Keisha's heart thumped. Maybe he had just been passing by, yet she couldn't shake the sense that he'd lingered for a reason. She closed the door softly, pressing her back against it. A delicate thrill coursed through her, swiftly replaced by a host of uncertainties. Did he too sense she didn't quite fit in these elegant hallways? Or was he seeing something else, something in her that might change everything? Keisha shook her head, trying to push the thought away. Tomorrow would bring a fresh round of tasks and challenges. For now, she needed rest. Still, as she lay back on her cot in the darkness, one image stayed in her mind. Richard's silent figure at the end of the corridor, that half-shadowed face turned in her direction. It left her with a nagging feeling that this was only the beginning of the surprises that the mansion and its owner had in store for her. At the end of her first day, Keisha notices Richard lingering at the far end of the corridor, looking intently in her direction. He quickly disappears, leaving her to wonder if he, too, senses she doesn't quite fit, or if he sees something else entirely. Keisha woke to thin sunlight flickering through the small window of her cramped room, her mind still churning from the unsettling moment the night before. Her thoughts traveled back to the hallway, where Richard Dawson had paused at a distance, as if trying to unravel some puzzle. She wondered if it had really been her imagination, or if he had truly lingered there, observing her quietly. Either way, she had slept fitfully, and her reflection in the mirror reminded her of that. She looked pale and uncertain, with faint shadows under her eyes. Still, she had a job to do and precious little time to think about why a powerful heir might be watching her from down the corridor. She hurried into her uniform, making sure to smooth down any stray wrinkles, then slipped on her flat black shoes. Before stepping out, she inhaled deeply, reminding herself that her grandparents depended on her. As she closed her door, the same hush greeted her in the upper floors of the mansion, a hush broken only by a distant whir of some vacuum and the subdued chatter of a few staff carrying linens. Descending the back stairs, she emerged into the main hallway, nearly running into Richard himself. Her heart fluttered, and she forced herself to stand up straight. She wanted to thank him for not letting that guest humiliate her the night before, but her nerves wove her tongue into knots. He was in the midst of reviewing a clipboard with the butler, Mr. Harris, who stepped aside the moment she appeared. "Good morning," Keisha ventured softly, hoping to sound composed. Richard glanced at her with a polite nod, but there was a flicker of warmth in his eyes. His reply was succinct, "Morning," before he returned his attention to the clipboard. In a breath, he and Mr. Harris were strolling away, discussing final arrangements for the upcoming charity event. Keisha stood there for a moment, feeling the gentle aftershock of his presence. She convinced herself that his brevity didn't mean disinterest. Given the swirl of tasks he must be juggling, it was likely the best greeting she could expect. Soon, Keisha was swept into the day's whirlwind. The event was one night away, and staff was buzzing everywhere. In the kitchen, she discovered Mrs. Watts stirring a creamy sauce with one hand while making notes on a small pad with the other. The cook's eyes lit up when Keisha entered, and she beckoned her over. "They're delivering crates of champagne in an hour," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "After they arrive, we'll need them stored in the cellar until this evening's minor gathering, then brought up again fresh tomorrow for the big charity event. And do be careful. Those bottles cost a small fortune." Keisha nodded vigorously, though the idea of transporting countless delicate bottles made her stomach dip. She recalled almost dropping the tall stack of glassware before. A part of her dreaded another fiasco, but Mrs. Watts patted her shoulder encouragingly. "Just do your best, dear," she said with a warm smile that gave Keisha a bit more resolve. While waiting for the delivery, Keisha busied herself preparing small fruit platters. She sliced strawberries and arranged them around the edges of silver trays, layering clusters of grapes at the center. Even with so many tasks to juggle, she found a small sense of peace in making the platters look bright and appealing. Occasionally, she'd glance up to find Mrs. Watts watching her with gentle approval, a reminder that not everyone in the mansion doubted her abilities. A rush of activity announced the arrival of the champagne. She hurried outside to the service entrance where 2 delivery men unloaded large crates from a truck. Mr. Harris stood by, clipboard in hand, double-checking the count. When Keisha offered to help carry the crates, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Make sure you don't drop anything," he said in a flat tone. "We can't afford accidents this close to the event." Her arms trembled under the weight of the first crate, but she pressed her lips together and carefully navigated the stone steps that led down to the cellar. The musty scent of cool earth enveloped her as she reached the bottom. She placed the crate on a wooden shelf, exhaling in relief. On the third trip, she nearly lost her balance on a slightly warped step, but she caught herself and somehow managed to keep the champagne bottles intact. After an hour of back and forth, the job was done. Though her legs were shaking, she felt proud to have accomplished something without mishap. Mr. Harris didn't congratulate her, but his neutral nod suggested she'd at least met his standard this time. When she returned to the kitchen, Mrs. Watts handed her a glass of water. "You've worked hard," she said kindly. "I can see you're doing your best." Keisha couldn't speak for a moment, simply grateful for the compassion. It reminded her that behind the mansion's stiff facade, she did have a small circle of support. She barely had time to catch her breath before the housekeeper, Mrs. Bancroft, ushered her to the ballroom. The large space, previously subdued, now bristled with life. Technicians testing the sound system, decorators hanging opulent draperies, florists placing blooming centerpieces on cloth-draped tables. The hum of chatter and the occasional static feedback from a microphone made Keisha's head spin. It was her first time seeing the ballroom in full preparation mode, and the shimmer of the chandeliers made everything feel theatrical, as if she'd walked onto a stage. "What a night tomorrow will be," one of the technicians muttered while checking the cables. "All the big names of New York, celebrities, philanthropists, maybe a senator or 2. Keisha overheard. Her curiosity piqued. She realized she might be serving these high-profile guests, and a wave of anxiety rolled over her. She took a moment to ground herself, remembering that she needed to remain poised no matter who arrived. She spent the rest of the afternoon polishing silverware and ensuring every table had the correct arrangements, listening intently to Mrs. Bancroft's instructions. From the corner of her eye, she sometimes caught sight of a few staff members exchanging glances, whispering about Richard's rumored engagement. One of them speculated that he'd be announcing his bride-to-be at the charity gala. Another suggested it was a rumor fueled by the Dawson family, who wanted him to settle down. Keisha found herself lingering on these whispers, trying to piece together what it meant for the stoic, quiet man she'd encountered. The thought of him being forced into an engagement for business reasons made her uneasy. She recalled the compassion he'd shown her, however reserved. Could a person bound by social expectations feel anything genuine for a staff member he barely knew? Evening arrived faster than Keisha expected. A more intimate gathering was scheduled for tonight, serving as a prelude to the main event. A philanthropic sponsor was already in the lounge, sipping a cocktail and examining the room's decor. Keisha stepped closer, offering to take his empty glass. He was polite enough, nodding in thanks, though his focus quickly shifted back to discussing donation amounts with Mr. Harris. Just as she retreated, she glimpsed Richard entering the lounge, greeting the sponsor with a firm handshake. He stood tall, shoulders set, commanding respect with very few words. Keisha felt a flutter of nerves. She wasn't sure why his presence affected her so much. Maybe it was his calm self-assurance, or the lingering memory of how he'd quietly stepped in to keep that rude guest from humiliating her further. In any case, it was hard not to watch him. Still, with so many tasks, she had no time to linger on what might be. She hurried back to the kitchen, where Mrs. Watts handed her a tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres to pass around. Balancing the tray on her palm, she stepped back into the lounge, weaving between small clusters of guests and staff. She kept her posture as upright as she could recall from Mr. Harris's endless lessons. The last thing she wanted was another near disaster. After what felt like hours on her feet, the small gathering gradually dispersed. As soon as Keisha set her empty tray on the kitchen counter, she felt the exhaustion tugging at her again. Tomorrow's event would be much bigger, with nearly 100 guests. She couldn't imagine the scale of tasks that awaited, but she intended to rise to the challenge. Late that evening, she headed to her room to catch her breath. Before she could make it upstairs, she heard hushed voices in the corridor. She recognized the butler's measured tones, followed by a quieter voice that sounded like Richard's. Instinctively, Keisha pressed herself flat against the wall, carefully peeking around the corner. Richard appeared concerned, discussing final details for tomorrow, no trace of his usual calm. Mr. Harris's face was rigid as he took notes. When they parted ways, Richard briefly caught sight of Keisha. A soft, fatigued grin touched his lips, and then he strode on, leaving her with a racing heartbeat. She wasn't sure what to think, only that each day brought her further into the intricate tapestry of the Dawson household. She returned to her room, her mind spinning with the day's events, along with the fleeting glimpses of Richard's moments of kindness. A heavy night's rest did her good. The morning sun found her more collected, despite the monumental to-do list. Downstairs, the mansion was in a controlled frenzy. Delivery after delivery arrived, floral arrangements, extra table linens, more cases of champagne, even a few glimmering display stands for the silent auction. Keisha spent the morning ferrying items to their respective places, occasionally brushing elbows with florists and event planners who barely noticed her. By late afternoon, the ballroom gleamed like a scene out of a film, complete with elegant centerpieces and shimmering lights. Staff moved about with polished determination. Keisha dressed in a fresh uniform, her hair neatly pinned back. Her heart beat with a mixture of excitement and dread. She recognized that the charity event tonight would be critical for Mr. Dawson's reputation, and, by extension, for her position. The first wave of guests arrived at dusk. Wealthy donors in designer attire slipped from sleek vehicles, greeted by polite staff who guided them through the foyer. Keisha stood by with a tray of chilled champagne, offering glasses to the newcomers. The swirl of perfume, the chatter of greetings, and the hush of refined footsteps on marble floors brought an almost electric energy to the air. She did her best to smile in a gracious but unobtrusive way. Suddenly, the soft hum of the crowd parted, revealing a man stepping into the foyer. He was tall, strikingly dressed in a tailored suit, and wore an expression of immediate disapproval. His eyes fell on Keisha like a hawk sighting its prey. He refused the champagne she offered, barely masking his disdain with a curt headshake. For a moment, she wondered if he recognized her from somewhere, though that seemed impossible. Something about his glare felt personal. She tried not to let it rattle her, but his obvious contempt unsettled her composure. Casting her gaze down, she took a slow breath, attempting to maintain her professionalism. More guests moved around him, collecting glasses and exchanging polite conversation, yet she could still sense the weight of his gaze. As the crowd began mingling deeper into the ballroom, Keisha finally dared to glance at the man once more. Their eyes locked, and he kept his expression cold and dismissive. She shifted her stance, bracing for some kind of confrontation she couldn't yet define. Her stomach tensed, warning her that this brief clash might only be the beginning. She carefully turned away, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. From across the bustling crowd, Keisha locks eyes with an elegantly dressed man who gives her a disdainful glance. She senses a confrontation brewing. An uneasy feeling settles in her stomach as she prepares to serve. Keisha moved through the growing crowd in the ballroom, the polished tray of champagne glasses balanced on one hand. Nervous energy radiated from her. She couldn't shake the memory of that man's intense, condescending stare when he first arrived. He was tall, immaculately dressed, and clearly unafraid to show his disdain. Now, as more guests filtered in, Keisha did her best to blend into the surroundings, offering drinks while keeping her gaze lowered. Every so often she felt the prickling awareness that his eyes were on her again, evaluating and judging without a word. A string quartet played in the corner, their graceful notes weaving through bright chatter and laughter. Waiters and waitresses darted between round tables draped in ivory cloth, laden with sparkling centerpieces. The gentle clink of crystal on crystal mingled with the hum of wealthy conversation. Keisha paused near a group of guests, distributing flutes of champagne. Just as she turned, a hush fell over them, and one of the women asked in a pointed tone, "And you are?" Startled, Keisha nearly lost her grip on the tray. "I'm Keisha," she replied quietly, aware of the curious, scrutinizing eyes turning her way. The elegantly dressed woman gave a slight sniff and accepted her glass without a thank you. Keisha swallowed, forcing a polite smile before stepping back. She reminded herself that this job was crucial for her grandparents' sake, that no amount of rudeness could deter her from holding on to this position. Still, her pulse was unsteady with the tension that seemed to coil in the air. As she skirted the dance floor, she felt someone behind her. Glancing over her shoulder, she locked eyes with the same man who had glared at her. This time, he didn't just stare. He took a pointed step in her direction, halting her in place. Up close, she could see the faint lines of impatience etched around his mouth. "Another glass for me," he said, snapping his fingers, though his flute was only half empty. She lifted one from the tray, offering it with a calm expression. Before he accepted it, he gave her a look so dismissive she felt her cheeks burn. "You're new here, aren't you?" he remarked. His voice carried just enough volume to catch the attention of a couple standing nearby, their eyes flicking to Keisha as though she were some exhibit. "I can't imagine they let just anyone serve in the Dawson mansion, but perhaps standards have slipped." The sting was immediate, and the man's gaze raked over her uniform and then her face, as though searching for faults. Keisha did her best to keep her composure, though her chest tightened with anger and hurt. She could feel the tremor in her hand as she held out the crystal flute. He plucked it from her fingers with exaggerated care. "Try not to spill on my suit. It's worth more than—" He didn't finish, and a few people in the vicinity let out little coughs that might have been amusement or discomfort. Keisha exhaled, her sense of dignity warring with her need to stay calm. A sharp retort rose in her throat, but she pushed it down. She wouldn't risk her job by snapping at an arrogant guest. She dipped her head and said, "I'll be careful," before turning to go. but he moved in front of her again, blocking her path. "Aren't you going to apologize?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. "For what?" she asked, confusion stealing over her. He acted like she'd already committed some outrageous error. The man twisted his mouth into a cruel line. He took a sip of champagne, never taking his eyes off her. "You nearly bumped into me just now. Or did you not see me standing here?" His voice dripped with condescension. Keisha felt her stomach knot at the injustice of it. She forced herself to remain level. "I'm sorry if I got too close," she managed. "I didn't mean to cause any inconvenience." He let out a dismissive laugh, shaking his head as though he found her words amusing. "Of course you didn't." Then, with a flick of his wrist, he stepped aside. "Next time, watch where you're going." Humiliation and anger crashed through her. She turned away, searching for a moment to collect herself. As she retreated to the edge of the room, she almost collided with Mr. Harris, the mansion's butler, who looked on the verge of scolding her for the near incident. But before he could speak, she mumbled, "Excuse me," and hurried past him, praying she could find a quiet corner to breathe. She found that corner in the hallway leading to the library, where the chatter was muted by thick walls and the door's ornate woodwork. Standing with her back pressed against the corridor's paneling, she tried to control the tremble in her hands. She thought of her grandparents again, steadying herself with the memory of their faces. Just a few more hours, she told herself. Summoning her courage, she re-entered the ballroom. Light glimmered from the chandeliers, painting dancing shapes across the polished floor. More guests had arrived, forming glittering pockets of conversation throughout the room. Keisha fetched another tray of champagne, determined to redeem herself after that rattling encounter. She circled the perimeter of the room, offering drinks and small smiles. Then everything happened at once. She felt a shove, light but purposeful, against her shoulder. Champagne glasses tilted dangerously. She spun around, desperate to steady the tray, and saw the same man smirking at her. Before she could recover her balance, the topmost flute slipped. In a flare of panic, she grasped for it, but her fingers only brushed the stem. Glass shattered on the marble floor with a startling crash, sending delicate shards skittering in every direction. Guests close by gasped and stepped back, some of them clutching their drinks to avoid the spray of champagne. Keisha's heart lurched. She could already imagine Mr. Harris's furious expression, the head housekeeper's reproach, and the rumors that would swirl among the staff. Blood roared in her ears. She opened her mouth to apologize, to say anything, when the man barked a laugh. "Look at you," he sneered. "Can't even carry a tray without making a scene." In the charged silence, Keisha tried to keep her voice steady. "It slipped," she said. "I'm sorry." She stooped, carefully beginning to pick up shards with trembling hands. The man's next remark rang out like a whip crack. "People like you should know your place." She felt a fierce heat pricking behind her eyes. "People like me?" she asked softly, glancing up. He shrugged, swirling his own champagne as though he'd done nothing at all. "Untrained, uneducated, walking in here like you belong." He let his words trail off, their meaning hanging in the air. A handful of guests stared, and a knot of staff members hovered near the doorway, uncertain whether to intervene. Keisha took a shaky breath, shards still clutched in her fingers. She felt a surge of anger, but also a yearning to stand up for herself. "You have no right to speak to me like that," she said, her voice trembling but unwavering. His lips twisted. "Oh, I have every right. I'm a paying guest and you're just—" Suddenly someone cleared his throat behind them. Richard Dawson stepped forward, expression poised between politeness and quiet fury. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze flicking from the broken glass on the floor to the man's mocking smirk. Keisha froze, not sure how to explain. The man snapped, "Yes, your staff bumped into me, nearly ruined my suit, and she's acting like it's my fault." Richard's eyes lingered on Keisha, scanning the tension in her posture. Then he looked at the man calmly. "I apologize on behalf of my household if there was any inconvenience," he said, but there was a coolness in his voice. "Yet I'm certain no one here intended to harm you." The man opened his mouth to argue, but Richard's steady gaze didn't waver. "Keisha," Richard said quietly, stepping to her side, "are you hurt?" He didn't bother to hide the concern in his voice. She shook her head, heart pounding. The guest snorted. "Hurt? She's clumsy enough to be a danger to herself." With that, he gestured to the shattered glass. "Are we going to continue this show, or can someone clean up so we can move on with the evening?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Of course," he said, still keeping his composure. He turned to a nearby staff member, motioning to bring a broom and dustpan. "This is an accident, nothing more. I'll thank you not to belittle my staff again." The tension in his tone made it clear he wouldn't tolerate further insults. Stunned silence settled around them. The guest, evidently unused to being challenged, gave a scornful laugh, then spun on his heel and stalked away, his steps echoing across the marble. Keisha breathed shakily, overwhelmed by the hush that had fallen. Richard crouched beside her, picking up a few larger shards she still clutched. "You're bleeding," he murmured, noticing a small cut on her hand. He turned to the staff member holding the dustpan. "Take care of the rest, please." Keisha allowed him to help her up, feeling the eyes of half the ballroom on them. He guided her to the side, away from the curious stares. "Let me see your hand." She winced as a thin bead of blood welled up, but it was minor, just a surface cut. Still, the gentleness in Richard's voice made tears threaten to escape. She blinked them back, battling embarrassment. Mr. Harris arrived, nearly trembling with outrage at the scene. Before he could speak, Richard held up a calm hand. "It's fine," he said decisively. "Please see that the broken glass is cleared away and that the floor is safe for the other guests." The butler pressed his lips together but obeyed. Only then did Richard turn his attention fully back to Keisha. "Come with me," he said softly, ushering her into the corridor. They walked away from the crowds murmuring, the music swelling again behind them, as if the evening was determined to continue. Keisha tried to slow her breathing, the adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. When they reached a quieter side passage, Richard stopped, leaning in slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. She managed a nod. "I'm sorry," she whispered, cheeks hot. "I promise it won't happen again." He studied her for a moment, looking as if he had more to say but hesitated. Finally, he sighed. "You don't have to apologize for someone else's behavior. That guest was out of line. If it were up to me, no one would speak to my staff like that." His words made her feel oddly protected, and she realized with surprise that the swirl of hurt and shame was giving way to gratitude. Something in her chest fluttered. "Thank you," she murmured. "I was afraid of losing my job." "You're not losing your job," Richard said gently. "Just be careful. The next time someone like that provokes you, come find me or Mr. Harris. No one has the right to treat you like that." She nodded, still shaken, but touched by his concern. Their eyes met in a moment of understanding. Then the distant clink of glasses reminded them both that they stood in the middle of a busy evening. Richard straightened, his formal demeanor returning. "You may want to get your cut looked at," he said. "Then, carry on." "I will," she replied, softly pressing her fingertips to the small wound. He gave her a short nod before heading back into the ballroom, where important guests still waited. For a moment, Keisha stood alone in the corridor, every nerve alive from that confrontation. How close had she come to utter disaster? If Richard hadn't intervened, the guest might have demanded she be fired on the spot. She spent the remainder of the evening fulfilling her duties more cautiously, avoiding that man's path whenever possible. Fortunately, no further incidents marred the night. Once the main festivities ended and the last champagne flute was put away, Keisha sought solace in the quiet halls. Her mind replayed the scene of Richard stepping in to defend her, how his eyes sparked with something deeper than polite civility. She wasn't used to being protected like that by anyone outside her own family. Eventually, she drifted down the corridor leading to the library, the soft glow of a single lamp guiding her. The tall shelves of worn books exuded a comforting hush, like a secret refuge hidden at the heart of the mansion. The plush armchairs beckoned her tired body, and she sank into one, exhausted yet unable to stop thinking about what had transpired. She told herself she'd only rest for a moment. She needed to gather her thoughts, quell the tumult of excitement, embarrassment, and cautious hope swirling in her mind. Just as Keisha settles into the dimly lit library, the head housekeeper appears in the doorway, warning her that Richard is under immense pressure to announce his engagement soon, hinting that Keisha's presence may cause more complications than she realizes. Keisha sat in the near dark of the library, her heartbeat still unsteady from the confrontation with the arrogant guest earlier that evening. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Bancroft, had appeared in the doorway moments ago, her warning echoing in Keisha's thoughts. According to Mrs. Bancroft, Richard was under serious pressure to announce an engagement soon, an arrangement that sounded more like a business transaction than a romantic commitment. The mention of it made Keisha uneasy, reminding her that at the end of the day, this was his world of wealth and power. She was only part of the staff, a newcomer without any real claim to his time or attention. She eventually left the library, walking back through the long corridors, where the grand tapestries and polished floors only sharpened her sense of not belonging. Passing the main hallway, she spotted Mr. Harris guiding a few lingering guests out the front doors. It was late, and the mansion had finally begun to settle into a late-night hush. Keisha paused near the staircase, her eyes wandering over the portraits that lined the wall. She wondered for the 100th time if it had been foolish to take this job, stepping into a realm so far removed from her own. But as always, her grandparents' faces rose in her mind, pushing her onward. She had to send money home. That was all the reason she needed to stay. The next morning came too soon, and with it a bustling wave of chores. The charity gala was over, but the Dawson mansion ran on a non-stop schedule. Staff hurried to reset the house for smaller events, private gatherings, or simply to maintain the estate's pristine condition. Keisha was assigned to help Mrs. Watts inventory the kitchen supplies. She spent hours scanning shelves, counting linens, and checking off the spices and baking supplies that had run low. Mrs. Watts kept up a cheerful commentary, occasionally cracking a joke about how all that fancy food rarely ended up in any staff member's belly. Keisha found some comfort in the older woman's good humor, yet beneath the routine she sensed a new tension in the household. Whispers followed Richard's every move. One of the junior maids, eyes bright with curiosity, mentioned a rumored meeting that afternoon with a significant investor who held sway over several of Richard's business ventures. Keisha pretended she wasn't listening, but the maid's words made her sharpen her hearing. She recalled Mrs. Bancroft's warning and felt a knot form in her stomach. She got her next clue shortly before lunch, when she was asked to bring tea service to an upstairs lounge. Approaching with a silver tray, Keisha heard Richard's low voice through the slightly ajar door, along with a sharper, unfamiliar tone. She hesitated, uncertain whether to knock immediately or wait. Then the sharper voice rose enough that she caught a snatch of the conversation. "Reputation on the line, Dawson. You know that, don't you?" It sounded like a threat, or at least a stern reminder of obligations. Keisha's heart hammered. She knocked softly, pushing open the door. Richard stood by a window, arms folded over his chest. A lean man in a tailored suit paced by the coffee table, his expression agitated. Both looked up as Keisha entered with the tea tray. She kept her eyes on the porcelain cups and sugar bowl, trying not to register the tension crackling between them. The man gave her a dismissive glance, then turned back to Richard as if she were invisible. Setting the tray down carefully, Keisha poured a cup and offered it to the guest, whose pinched mouth barely formed a perfunctory "thank you." Richard gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, an unspoken apology for making her witness this strained meeting. Keisha left quickly, her pulse fluttering with uneasy curiosity. She wished she knew what power this man held over Richard and whether it had anything to do with the rumored engagement. Downstairs, the day dragged on. Keisha found it difficult to focus on her tasks. She misread a label on a spice jar, receiving a mild scolding from Mr. Harris for being careless. During the afternoon tea preparation for the staff, she almost spilled the sugar bowl, her nerves shot from unanswered questions and an undercurrent of unease that wove through the halls. The staff, too, seemed on edge. Mrs. Bancroft barked orders in clipped tones, and Mr. Harris looked as though he hadn't slept. By late afternoon, Keisha had a short break. She found Mrs. Watts in the kitchen, wiping down the counters after a long round of meal prep. The cook was never short on conversation, so Keisha ventured, "Mrs. Watts, do you know anything about Richard's investor, the one in the suit who was pacing around upstairs?" Mrs. Watts paused, considering whether to speak. Her round face creased with sympathy. "We don't usually poke our noses into Mr. Dawson's business," she said gently. "But that man's been around before. He's an important link for some big contracts from what I hear, could make or break them with a single phone call." Keisha felt a prick of worry. "And this engagement rumor, do you think it's tied to that?" The cook gave her a searching look but only sighed. "I wouldn't be surprised, child. Around here, a lot of decisions get entangled with marriage alliances and strategic partnerships. It's how the wealthy keep their circles tight." The words settled like a weight in Keisha's chest. She thanked Mrs. Watts for her honesty, though it wasn't exactly comforting. If Richard was under pressure to secure an engagement, it might mean forming a carefully chosen relationship to satisfy powerful people. Keisha told herself it was none of her concern. He was a man of means with a life far removed from her own. She tried to brush the thought away, but a small flicker of hurt lanced through her, surprising her with its intensity. She hated to admit it, but she'd come to respect him deeply, even feel a distant warmth. The idea of him being coerced into an empty commitment stirred an unexpected pang of sadness. That evening, the mansion seemed subdued. The hectic charity gala was behind them, leaving a stillness that made each hushed footstep echo. Keisha was assigned to tidy up the side parlors used during the day's smaller meetings. She dusted tables, rearranged cushions, and straightened books that had been left out by a few late-afternoon visitors. The soft lamplight reminded her of how cozy this place could be once you looked past the formalities. As she worked, she noticed Richard standing on the veranda, silhouetted against the twilight. He had one hand resting on the railing and his posture looked weary. Keisha hesitated, unsure if she should leave him be or offer a quiet greeting. Before she could decide, he turned and spotted her through the open French doors. Their eyes met. His seemed burdened, reflecting that same tension she'd felt all day. Wordlessly, he beckoned her closer. She stepped across the threshold, the cool evening air carrying a faint scent of gardenias. "How are you doing?" he asked quietly, as though they were old friends instead of employer and staff member. His question caught her off guard. "I'm all right," she replied. "Just finished tidying the parlors." She paused. "I hope everything's okay with your business." A slight sad smile ghosted across his face. "A lot's riding on decisions I have to make very soon." She noticed the flicker of vulnerability in his voice. "You have a lot of people counting on you," she said softly. His gaze flicked to hers, as if weighing how much to share. "Sometimes it feels like I'm torn between what I want and what everyone else demands." He let out a slow breath, then offered a small nod of thanks, as if acknowledging that her presence was a rare moment of honesty. "I appreciate all your hard work around the house," he added more formally. "I know it's not easy." Keisha felt warmth bloom in her chest. "Thank you for looking out for me," she managed. They stood in companionable silence for a moment. The sky above had deepened to a velvety blue, the first stars pricking through. In the distance, she could hear night insects tuning their voices. It felt strangely intimate to share this stillness. Before she could think of what else to say, footsteps approached. Mr. Harris's voice broke the evening calm. "Mr. Dawson, you have a phone call. It sounds urgent." Richard tensed, nodded at Keisha, and vanished inside. She watched him go, a tangle of thoughts swirling behind her eyes. She soon discovered the urgency of the call had been no exaggeration. Mr. Harris returned, somber-faced, bustling past Keisha as if on a mission. She tried to ask if something was wrong, but he brushed by, muttering about an immediate consultation for Mr. Dawson. Once again, the mansion's hush was disturbed by the tension of unseen problems swirling through its corridors. Night drew on. Most of the staff had retreated to their quarters, worn out from the day. Keisha lingered downstairs, feeling restless. She told herself she was simply checking the locks on windows or making a final pass through the corridors, but in truth, she had a restless feeling that something else might happen tonight, something important to Richard. Halfway down a dim corridor, she heard raised voices. One belonged to Richard, the other was the clipped, sharper tone of the investor from earlier in the day. Keisha didn't want to eavesdrop, but the words floated through the door to Richard's office, swirling in tense anger. She slid behind a large potted plant, keeping herself out of sight while still able to hear. "We made it clear," the investor was saying. "Announce your fiancé, or we're going to withdraw our support. Our partners expect a man they invest in to maintain a stable, conventional image." Keisha shut her eyes, her heart aching for Richard, who remained silent for a beat. Then his voice rumbled low with quiet frustration. "I won't be strong-armed into a loveless arrangement," he said. "This is my life." A short laugh cut him off. "Your life, yes, but our money. You need to decide which is more valuable to you. This is your last warning." Keisha felt frozen in place, listening to them trade words that vibrated with power and desperation. Was this really how decisions were made in his world? By pushing someone to marry for the sake of business? A chill sank into her bones. She could almost sense Richard's struggle, his conflicting loyalty to the mansion's legacy and his own sense of integrity. Part of her wished she could burst into the office and defend him, but she knew better. She was just the staff, a nobody in this sphere of high-stakes demands. She heard the thud of a fist on a desk, then footsteps. Fearful of being caught, she quickly slipped away, heart pounding. Her mind swirled with everything she'd just overheard, the words repeating like a broken record, "Announce your fiancé or we withdraw our support." The worst part was realizing that Richard, despite his wealth, was cornered. Just before bed, Keisha overhears a heated argument in Richard's office. The investor threatens to retract funding if Richard doesn't present his fiancée soon. Keisha's breath catches as she realizes just how cornered he truly is. Keisha woke the next day with the echo of the investor's harsh words still reverberating in her mind. She could see the strain seeping into every corner of the Dawson mansion. Though the corridors were scrubbed to a gleaming polish and the windows allowed bright summer light to filter in, the tension behind the scenes was impossible to ignore. Staff whispered in subdued tones, and the phones rang more often than usual with urgent-sounding calls for Richard. She dove into her tasks with renewed focus, hoping to stay invisible amidst the tension. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Bancroft, dispatched her to ensure the rooms remained spotless ahead of a new philanthropic event scheduled for that afternoon. It seemed Richard had invited potential donors to discuss charity initiatives, an event he'd ordinarily plan carefully and enjoy, but this time Keisha sensed apprehension in the air. By late morning, she found herself helping Mrs. Watts in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with steady strokes of the knife. The cook hummed as she worked, telling Keisha about a lavish lunch they had to prepare: smoked salmon, delicate pastries, fruit tarts. But behind her usual warmth, Mrs. Watts looked worried. "Mr. Dawson's wearing himself thin," she remarked in a hushed tone, "and with the way business talk has been going, I can't blame him." Keisha nodded, unable to shake the memory of Richard's eyes, shadowed with conflict, the night before. As guests began arriving, Keisha positioned herself in the foyer with a tray of cold drinks. The entry was a swirl of sophisticated men and women stepping out of sleek cars. Polite smiles, hushed greetings, and the subtle rustle of designer clothing filled the space. Keisha's heart skipped a beat whenever the mansion doors opened, half expecting a certain investor, one who had threatened to withdraw funding if Richard didn't produce a fiancé soon, to appear and cause more havoc. Instead, a succession of potential donors drifted in with only mild curiosity about the staff. Suddenly, there was a shift in the atmosphere. A new arrival swept into the foyer, drawing the eyes of every other guest. She was tall, dressed in a form-fitting black dress that accentuated her poised figure. Her hair gleamed in sculpted waves, and the soft click of her heels on the marble floors seemed to announce her confidence. Keisha's chest tightened. Something about this woman's entrance radiated authority and an air of possession. She paused by Keisha's tray, her gaze sweeping over the young server from head to toe. "Is Richard inside?" she asked, her voice smooth as silk. Keisha managed a nod. She wanted to stammer a polite greeting, but the woman had already turned, crossing the foyer with an elegant sway. The aroma of expensive perfume hung in the air where she'd stood. In the hush that followed, Keisha heard a quiet murmur among the other staff. That must be Charlotte, Richard Dawson's ex. Keisha felt a twist in her stomach. Mrs. Bancroft had mentioned an old flame, someone who'd once been close to a formal engagement with Richard until it fell apart. But seeing her in the flesh was disconcerting. Charlotte seemed everything Keisha was not. Glamorous, assured, exuding the privilege of belonging in a world of riches. For a moment, Keisha's self-consciousness flared, reminding her of her own simple uniform and the life of constant diligence she led just to pay for her grandparents' needs. Soon, she had to rejoin the other staff in the dining room, placing silverware for the luncheon. Across the polished table, Mr. Harris directed the arrangement of cutlery and crystal glasses, while Mrs. Watts oversaw the final touches on the menu. When Keisha lifted her gaze, she glimpsed Charlotte entering with Richard, their conversation animated yet restrained. Richard's face seemed tense, though he pasted on a polite half-smile for the sake of the guests. Charlotte leaned in, murmuring something that only he could hear. A short while later, the luncheon commenced. Keisha circulated among the guests, refreshing water glasses and offering bread baskets. She tried to keep her eyes off Charlotte, but it proved impossible. Every time the elegant woman laughed lightly at some remark, Keisha felt an unspoken tension. Perhaps it was in the way Charlotte's hand grazed Richard's arm as though by habit, or how her eyes flicked around, assessing the mansion with a proprietary gleam. It was just as they were bringing out the final course, a collection of delicate fruit tarts, that things took a sharp turn. Charlotte followed Keisha into the smaller sitting room adjacent to the dining area, where Keisha was about to collect empty plates. The woman's presence filled the space like a silent warning. Folding her arms, Charlotte gazed at Keisha with an unreadable expression. "I've been hearing rumors about how Mr. Dawson's staff is growing bolder," Charlotte said softly. "Especially you. People say you're quite close to him these days." Her tone was smooth, but the meaning beneath it sharp. Keisha set down the plates carefully, trying not to betray the sudden hammering of her heart. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Charlotte took a step closer, the scent of her perfume mingling with the sweet aroma of pastries. "Well, let me give you a piece of advice," she said. "Be careful not to overstep. Richard hates drama, and the last thing he needs right now is someone complicating his life, especially someone who might appear to be—" She paused, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, looking for a way to advance her own position. The insinuation pricked Keisha's pride. "I'm not after anything," she said quietly, swallowing back a fiercer retort. "Mr. Dawson has shown me kindness, that's all." Charlotte's lips curved into a disbelieving smile. kindness can be confused for something more in a place like this. With a small toss of her hair, she turned on her heel. If you're wise, you'll remember your place. Keisha stood rooted to the spot, anger and embarrassment rolling through her in waves. Any response she might have given was silenced by Charlotte's haughty departure, the click of her heels echoing down the corridor. A part of her wanted to defend herself, to say she would never use Richard for her own gain. But the sting of Charlotte's words hung in the air, souring Keisha's confidence. She tried to shake it off as she carried the empty dishes back to the kitchen. The rest of the luncheon passed in a blur, overshadowed by that unsettling confrontation. Eventually, the guests took their leave, some politely shaking Richard's hand and promising future donations. Charlotte was among the last to go. When she waved goodbye, it was with a slow, knowing gesture toward Richard, as if their business was far from resolved. In the aftermath, Keisha found herself alone in the corridor, collecting forgotten napkins and straightening a few chairs. She sensed someone behind her and spun to see Richard, his expression grim. "Did Charlotte say something to you?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Keisha fumbled with her words. Only that I should watch myself." Richard sighed, pressing a hand to his temple. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping closer. "She tends to assume she has a say in everything I do. Look, please don't let her upset you." Keisha forced a small smile. "I'll be fine," she murmured. For a moment they lingered in the empty corridor, tension crackling between them. Richard opened his mouth to say something more, but a staff member appeared, requesting his presence for a phone call. With an apologetic glance, he nodded and left, leaving Keisha with mixed feelings swirling in her chest. That evening, the dining room was used for a smaller, more intimate dinner, just a handful of Richard's closest associates. Keisha noticed how exhausted he looked, going through the motions as conversation about finance and future projects swirled around the table. She carried platters of food and refilled glasses, aware that her presence drew a few curious stares from those who had witnessed the earlier tension. Most kept silent, but the underlying scrutiny weighed on her. Near the end of the meal, another unexpected moment stirred the night's rhythm. One of Richard's old acquaintances recognized Keisha as that waitress from the gala who had an incident. He made a half-joking remark about it in front of everyone, and the memory of champagne shattering across marble floors stung fresh in Keisha's mind. Unable to resist, she quietly defended herself. "That man shoved me," she said, voice controlled. "It wasn't entirely my fault." The acquaintance hesitated, somewhat embarrassed, and fell silent. But the air felt charged again. Richard glanced her way with quick concern, as if prepared to back her up. No one pressed the topic further, but she sensed that her standing in this household was no longer a mere matter of staff duties. She had, unwittingly, become a figure of curiosity, gossip, and perhaps controversy. Once the guests departed, Keisha made her way to the small kitchen sink to wash her hands. The day's tension still throbbed in her temples. So much had happened: a biting confrontation with Richard's ex, subtle jabs from guests, a swirling sense that the social demands on Richard were nearing a breaking point. She dried her hands and turned to see him standing there, his usually composed features marked by fatigue. He crossed the room in a few strides. "Keisha," he began in a low voice, "I'm sorry about all this. You shouldn't have to deal with Charlotte's accusations or anyone else's rudeness." Searching her eyes, he added, "I wish things were simpler." She could see the weariness in his face, the tension in his shoulders. Her anger and frustration softened. "It's not your fault," she said, voice gentle. "I just don't want to cause you any more trouble." His gaze flicked over her, and for a moment they stood in fragile quiet. Then he exhaled, seeming to lower the guard he always kept up around others. "I hate these dinners and deals," he admitted, almost in a whisper. "I hate pretending to enjoy them, and I hate that you're caught in the crossfire." Before she could reply, he stepped closer, placing a hesitant hand on her arm. It was an impulsive gesture, light as a whisper, but electric in its suddenness. Keisha's breath caught in her throat. In that stolen second, the rest of the mansion seemed to fall away. No clinking glasses, no watchful staff, no scathing remarks from ex-girlfriends or investors. Just two people grappling with a connection neither had planned for. Her heart pounded as she realized how near he was, and she briefly thought he might draw her into an embrace. But a footstep in the hall startled them both, snapping the moment in half. Richard withdrew his hand, the tension in his eyes sliding back behind a careful mask. "We should talk," he said quietly, "but not here." Keisha nodded, her own cheeks warming with the sudden surge of emotions. They parted ways to avoid suspicion, each returning to their separate responsibilities. Yet the memory of that touch lingered, fueling a swirl of hope and apprehension inside Keisha's mind. She performed her final tasks for the day on autopilot, mind spinning with what might happen if they truly acknowledged their mutual pull. It seemed both unimaginable and inevitable. When the house finally fell into its late-night hush, she returned to her small, plain room on the upper floor. She changed out of her uniform, her pulse still fluttering from thoughts of Richard. Just as she settled on the edge of her bed, there came a soft knock at the door. Her heart jumped, and she quickly stood. Turning the knob, she found him there in the dim light of the corridor. Richard shows up at Keisha's room door late that night, softly knocking. "We need to talk," he murmurs, voice filled with tension and something like longing. Keisha's breath caught in her throat the moment she opened the door. Richard stood there in the dim glow of the hallway lamp, his expression drawn with a mix of concern and something deeper, an emotion she couldn't place. It was near midnight, and the rest of the mansion had gone quiet, as though everyone and everything were holding its breath. She almost asked if anything was wrong, but the tension in his eyes said it all. Yes, something was very wrong, and he was here because neither of them could ignore it anymore. "May I come in?" he asked softly. There was a hint of urgency in his voice, but it was gentle too, as if he worried he might startle her. Keisha hesitated only a second before stepping aside and letting him enter her small, sparsely furnished room. She closed the door behind him, acutely aware of how the space seemed even tinier with him in it. Shadows flickered on the walls cast by the single bedside lamp. Richard folded his arms and took a breath. For a fleeting moment, neither spoke. Keisha's heart thumped so loudly she feared he might hear it. At last, he broke the silence. "I'm sorry for coming so late," he said, voice low. "I just couldn't sleep without talking to you. There's too much going on, and you're at the center of it now, whether we meant that or not." His words sank into the hush. Keisha stood near the foot of her narrow bed, fingers curled at her sides. "I'm listening," she whispered, a part of her bracing for the worst. She'd seen how he was cornered by investors, how rumors about him and Charlotte swirled. Perhaps he was here to tell her it was all a mistake, that she should leave before things got more complicated. A pang of preemptive hurt rippled through her at the thought, but he didn't send her away. Instead, he moved closer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm sorry for dragging you into my problems," he said. "I can see you're trying so hard to fit in, to do your work without stirring trouble, but trouble keeps finding you, and I keep letting it." He paused. "It isn't fair to you." Keisha's gaze flicked to the worn rug beneath their feet. "I'm not here to blame you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard sometimes. People assume I have no right to be here, or that I'm after something. All I ever wanted was to earn a living, help my grandparents." She hesitated, then decided to be honest. "And you keep surprising me. You step in to defend me, even when it's risky for you." His expression softened. "I can't stand by and let people treat you like that," he said. "Not when you're simply doing your job. Not when—" He cut himself off, frowning as though searching for the right words. "Not when I feel responsible, because if I'd been clearer about where I stand, maybe no one would think they could push you around." Heat rose in her cheeks. The air between them felt charged, like it might crackle at any second. She swallowed. "Where do you stand?" she asked gently, though her heart drummed anxiously. It was the question that had lingered ever since that first moment he'd defended her in the ballroom. Richard raked a hand through his hair, and for an instant, he looked like a man on the brink of confessing something he wasn't sure he could say. "I hate everything about these social charades," he began. "The forced engagements, the investors controlling my choices. I've felt stuck for so long, bound by expectations I never agreed to." He lifted his gaze to hers, taking a step closer. "Then you came along, and you're so genuine, so open, even when this house tries to stifle you. It makes me remember what it's like to want something real." His words sent a shiver through her. He was near enough now that she could see the faint lines of tiredness at the corners of his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "Richard," she murmured, her voice catching. She didn't know what else to say. All the complicated feelings, admiration, gratitude, attraction, surged up at once, robbing her of any coherent sentence. For a moment, they just stood there, the silence laden with unspoken confessions. It struck her that this was the first time she'd ever called him by his first name, with no pretense of formality. He didn't correct her. Rather, she saw a slight softening in his posture, as if hearing his own name freed him from the burden of the role he played for everyone else. Finally, he said, "I don't want you to get hurt by all this. If we're honest about how we feel, it will only make things more complicated. My investors are breathing down my neck, Charlotte's waiting in the wings, and my family expects me to announce an engagement to a suitable partner any day now." His gaze flickered. "I'm not blind. I know how badly this can end if we're not careful." Keisha's heart sank. "So, are you saying we should keep our distance?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. He hesitated, and in that pause, she saw how torn he was. "I tried that," he finally admitted. "But the more I try to keep my distance, the more I find myself drawn to you." His confession hung in the quiet room and time seemed to slow. She felt the weight of his honesty, felt it resonate with her own unspoken longing. She inhaled shakily, unsure if she had the courage to face what might come next. "I feel it too," she whispered. Admitting it out loud stirred a dizzy mix of relief and fear. "But I don't want to cost you everything. Your contracts, your reputation. It's not worth it." Richard's eyes flashed. "Don't say that. My choices are my own, and if my business partners can't respect them, maybe I should question whether I need them at all." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. His grip was warm, reassuring, despite the tremor of uncertainty running through them both. Caught up in the swell of emotion, she squeezed his fingers. "It's terrifying," she confessed. "I can't lose this job, and I don't want you to lose your future. But I can't ignore what's happening between us." He didn't reply with words. Instead, he gently tugged her a step closer, so close she could catch the soft scent of his cologne, feel the warmth of his body. Her heart pounded so fiercely it was almost painful. She gazed up, meeting his eyes, and in them saw not just desire, but understanding. Two people who'd collided in a place neither expected to find real connection. The rest of the world felt miles away. When he leaned down, it was delicate at first, as though checking if she was truly willing. Keisha's breath caught, then she tilted her head, allowing the kiss to find her lips. It was light, cautious, yet brimming with pent-up feeling. A moment of confession without words, an answer to all the confusion swirling in the corridors of the Dawson mansion. She lifted her free hand to rest against his shoulder, clinging to this fragile moment. If something in her life had to be uncertain, let it be everything but this fleeting intimacy. The world spun. She closed her eyes, letting herself taste the hope that maybe, despite every obstacle, something real and good could bloom here. But the fragile peace was short-lived. A sudden creak of floorboards in the hallway snapped them apart. They froze, hearts racing, bracing for the doorknob to turn. When no one came in, they exchanged charged looks. Awareness of the risk flickered in both their eyes. Richard stepped back, face taut with the reality they couldn't escape. "We have to be careful," he said, voice hushed. "This house has eyes and ears everywhere." Keisha swallowed, adrenaline flooding her. She nodded, slowly letting her hand slip from his. "You're right. We shouldn't draw attention." He scanned her face, regret mingled with lingering tenderness. "I don't want to leave like this, but we can't risk being caught here." She nodded again. "I understand. She paused, lowering her voice further. "I'll be careful." Richard hesitated a moment more, as if torn between staying and going. Then he carefully stepped around her, pulling the door open a crack. The hallway lamp threw a sliver of light across his features, accentuating the tension in his jaw. She gave him a faint, reassuring smile, and he slipped out, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. Alone in the hush, Keisha pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Even now, warmth lingered where they had touched. A swirl of emotions coursed through her: relief, excitement, guilt, fear. Her mind raced with thoughts of what might happen if the staff discovered them, or worse, if Charlotte or the investor got wind of this fledgling connection. The moment they'd shared felt precious and precarious in equal measure. She changed into her nightclothes, every sound amplified in the quiet. Outside, a pale moon cast faint patterns on the windowsill. Keisha sat on the edge of the bed, too restless to sleep. The mansion seemed to press in on her, with all its secrets and demands. She didn't regret the kiss. How could she? Yet she knew it was a spark that could grow into a flame, and flames in this household under its endless watch might consume them both if they weren't careful. Eventually, exhaustion weighed on her. She lay down, pulling the thin blanket over her shoulders, thoughts spinning between the memory of Richard's whispered confession and the uncertainty of what came next. She drifted into a fitful sleep, half expecting to hear footsteps outside her door at any moment. In her dreams, she was running through the mansion's many corridors, searching for Richard, never quite reaching him. Shortly before dawn, a sudden wave of anxiety jolted her awake. The first faint glow of sunrise touched the sky beyond her small window. Keisha sat up, heart fluttering. In the murky quiet of pre-dawn, she felt an inexplicable dread coil in her stomach. Something inside warned her that the fragile calm wouldn't last, that life in this mansion could shift on a dime, and not necessarily in their favor. Before dawn, Keisha wakes from a restless half-sleep to the ominous feeling that everything is about to change, and not necessarily for the better. Morning rays filtered into Keisha's narrow room, stirring her from an uneasy sleep. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her belly as a sudden wave of nausea washed over her. For days, she had brushed it off as the stress of working in this sprawling mansion, of juggling her mounting worries about Richard's business pressures. But as she hurried to the small bathroom at the end of the corridor, she felt the truth sharpen. This wasn't ordinary stress. She splashed cool water on her face, pausing to study her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes looked tired, her cheeks a touch paler than usual. Once again her stomach roiled in protest, and she forced herself to breathe slowly until the nausea subsided. The house was silent, most of the staff weren't up yet, and she slipped back to her room unnoticed. There she found the crumpled pharmacy bag hidden under her pillow, a pregnancy test, still unopened. She stared at it, mind darting back to the kiss she had shared with Richard, the late-night confessions, and the stolen tenderness that had blossomed between them. She'd felt so certain that even the faintest possibility of a child would be an unimaginable complication, and yet here she was, trembling as she tore open the box. It felt surreal, even as she followed the instructions with shaky hands. Moments later, the small test strip revealed a result that sent her mind spinning. She exhaled in shock, reading the sign that told her she was pregnant. Her vision blurred. This alone would turn her entire world upside down. But there was more. Her symptoms, the doctor's words from an impromptu checkup 2 days prior, and a hush that had fallen in the clinic hallway all echoed one staggering fact. Triplets. A thick lump formed in her throat. She hadn't planned on telling anyone, but the weight of the news was already more than she could bear alone. She dropped onto her bed, pressing her trembling hands to her abdomen. 3 little lives growing inside her. A tear slid down her cheek, half terror, half awe. One part of her wanted to run to Richard and tell him everything. Another part recoiled. What would he think? He was already backed into a corner with his investors. Would it look like she was trying to trap him, to drag him into a scandal? Eventually, practical necessity forced her to gather herself. She tucked the test out of sight and dressed for work, her mind whirling with questions. Outside her window, the mansion's immaculate gardens lay serene. It felt like a mocking contrast to the churning storm inside her. Downstairs, she found the kitchen humming with early activity. Mrs. Watts, as always, stirred something delicious in a large pot, greeting Keisha with a warm smile. But the cook's gaze flicked over her face with concern. "You look pale, dear," she murmured. "Here, have a little bit of tea before you start. It'll settle your stomach." Keisha tried to smile. "Thank you," she managed, taking the teacup in both hands. Its warmth soothed her momentarily, but nerves still fluttered in her belly. She wondered if she was already radiating some telltale glow. The notion seemed absurd. She was barely weeks along, and yet her entire body felt different, every emotion magnified. She spent the morning organizing fresh linens and checking the status of the guest rooms. At every turn, her thoughts returned to Richard. She kept replaying the look in his eyes the last time they spoke, torn between hope and worry. How would he react to the news that she carried his children, not just 1, but 3? By midday, Keisha stumbled upon Mr. Harris in the corridor, looking harried as he juggled phone calls. From his clipped tone, she gathered that Richard was under more pressure than ever. Contracts worth millions hung in the balance, and the investors wanted immediate updates on his personal life as well as his business expansions. The notion made her wince. She already knew he resented how his every move, especially his supposed engagement, was scrutinized. Bringing an unexpected pregnancy into the equation would only heighten the chaos. In one of the drawing rooms, a few staff members were tidying up after a minor meeting. Keisha overheard them talking in hushed voices about how the family was pressing Richard to announce a perfect fiancé soon. They mentioned a new rumor that Richard was on the verge of losing a major investor if he didn't solidify his position with a proper marriage. The mere mention made Keisha's stomach churn again. She busied herself dusting a tall vase, praying none of them would glance her way and see the worry etched across her face. A short while later, she passed by the library door and glimpsed Richard inside, kneading his forehead as if a headache threatened to split it. The door was ajar enough for her to note his posture, shoulders hunched, frustration tight in every line of his body. She felt an ache to go in, to place a gentle hand on his arm and say, "We'll figure this out." But the heaviness in her own heart paralyzed her. Telling him about the babies now might send him over the edge. And what if he doubted her motives? She'd heard enough horror stories of wealthy men viewing unplanned pregnancies with suspicion. She swallowed her longing, moving on. Perhaps if she waited, just a little longer, until the contract negotiations were more stable, the climate less volatile, she could find the right moment to sit him down and speak from the heart. But that plan filled her with dread too, because how long could she hide the changes in her own body? For days, she managed to keep her secret. She avoided heavy lifting and did her best to disguise her growing bouts of nausea and fatigue. A couple of times, Mrs. Watts eyed her strangely, almost as if she suspected something. The cook took to handing Keisha extra portions of bland crackers to help with that unsettled stomach. Keisha nodded gratefully, not daring to mention the real reason. All the while, she couldn't help noticing how Richard's manner toward her changed in subtle ways. He was more protective, more attentive, though never overtly. When he caught her carrying an armful of tablecloths, he'd come over and insist on helping. When she blanched at the smell of fish during dinner prep, he'd quietly usher her toward fresh air, murmuring, "Are you okay?" She suspected he felt her distress on some deeper level, but neither of them spoke directly about it. One afternoon, exhaustion hit her so hard she nearly fainted while polishing a silver tray. She stumbled against a side table, catching her breath in short gasps. The tray fell with a clang, but by sheer luck, it didn't break. Instantly, Richard appeared in the corridor, alarmed by the noise. He hurried over, steadying her by the elbows before she could protest. "Keisha, you're pushing yourself," he said, brow knit in concern. She forced a weak smile, insisting it was only a dizzy spell from missing breakfast. His eyes flickered with doubt, but he let it go. Meanwhile, her heart pounded with guilt. Hiding the truth felt more and more like a betrayal, but the thought of telling him, of unleashing a storm of complications, terrified her. By the following week, the tension in the mansion peaked. Investors threatened to pull out if Richard didn't finalize the personal matter that kept overshadowing his professional commitments. Charlotte lurked in the background, making cryptic comments about how Richard needed a refined partner who wouldn't tarnish the family name. And though no one said it to Keisha's face, she felt the mounting suspicion that something was off. She overheard staff members whispering that she looked ill, that perhaps she wasn't up to the rigorous standards of the household. That night, after another dizzy spell forced her to retreat early, she curled up in bed, staring at the ceiling. She felt the babies. Well, she couldn't literally feel them move yet, but she felt their presence, their promise. Tears pricked her eyes. She didn't want them to come into the world under a cloud of secrecy and fear. She thought of her grandparents who had always taught her to face life with dignity, no matter how unfair it seemed. They were the reason she'd taken this job in the first place, the reason she stayed even when it got hard. By morning, her mind was made up. She needed to tell Richard, whether or not it risked everything. She managed to stumble through her tasks until lunchtime, heart hammering with each tick of the ornate grandfather clock in the main hall. Finally, she learned from Mrs. Bancroft that Richard was in his office, deep in paperwork. Summoning all her courage, she made her way to the second floor. She walked down the corridor, each step echoing in her ears. Her stomach flipped, and not only from morning sickness. As she approached the carved mahogany door, her resolve wavered. Could she truly do this? She stood outside for an agonizing moment, hand hovering near the surface of the door. After drawing a shaky breath, she raised her fist to knock. Keisha stares at Richard's closed office door, mustering the courage to knock and tell him everything. Her hand lifts, trembling, just as the door swings open from the inside. Keisha stood frozen as the heavy office door swung open, revealing Richard on the threshold with his jacket slung over one arm. His eyes widened in surprise at finding her poised there, hand half raised as if about to knock. She struggled to form the words that had been circling her mind for days. "I need to tell you something urgent." But no sound escaped her. Her heart pounded, the truth knocking inside her chest as loudly as her own pulse. Richard started to speak, but an abrupt voice from within the office snapped, "We're not finished, Dawson!" A tall, severe-looking man with sharp features appeared behind him, stepping forward to peer at Keisha as though she were an unwelcome intruder. His suit looked expensive, but his demeanor radiated a cold authority. There was an air of frustration about him, as if he had grown tired of negotiations left unresolved. Richard glanced between them, jaw tight. "Keisha, I'm sorry, but I'm in the middle of a critical discussion." He hesitated, noticing the anxiety etched on her face. For a fleeting moment he touched her arm. "Are you all right?" Her mouth felt dry as sand. She willed herself to speak, to say something about her pregnancy before this stranger pushed them apart. Yes, but..." She stopped, her courage wavering under the stranger's withering gaze. "I'm Winston Sandoval," the man interrupted, looking down at her as though she were a minor inconvenience. "I'm here to finalize a few details with your employer." He arched an eyebrow, his impatience clear. "Why don't you allow us to finish our conversation?" Richard stiffened at the rudeness in Winston's tone, but before he could respond, Winston pulled him back inside, nodding curtly for Keisha to leave. Richard shot her an apologetic glance over his shoulder, clearly torn. Then he disappeared into the office, the door swinging shut with a dull thud. Keisha felt the corridor around her blur for a moment. She'd been so close to telling him, so close to unloading the fear and worry that she'd carried inside her for weeks. Now, she stood outside, alone, a wave of nausea rising in her throat. The weight of the news pressed on her chest until she could barely breathe. She hadn't come this far just to walk away without speaking. Gathering her resolve, she lingered near the door, hoping the conversation would wrap up soon. Low voices leaked through the panels, Winston's sharper and more forceful than Richard's. She caught fragments. Marriage announcement, investors, danger of losing the entire deal if you don't comply. The words twisted her stomach. 15 minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt elastic. She paced the corridor, glancing at the antique clock ticking at the far end of the hallway. Finally, the door burst open. Winston strode out with a satisfied sneer, adjusting his jacket cuffs. His gaze alighted on Keisha, and for an instant he seemed to size her up, reading more than her uniform. A flicker of realization crossed his features. Perhaps he sensed her vulnerability, the tension in her posture, the pallor of her face. "Still here?" he said with a wry tilt of his head. "My discussion with Mr. Dawson is finished for now." Then his voice dipped, like he'd discovered a shiny weakness to exploit. "He's making a grave mistake, letting personal entanglements jeopardize the future of the Dawson name. I told him as much." Keisha swallowed, trying not to reveal her trembling. She turned toward the office door, eager to slip past Winston and speak to Richard alone. But Winston sidestepped, blocking her. The corridor seemed to shrink around them. "You're Keisha, isn't it?" he said, his voice quieter now, as if he were imparting a secret. "I've heard rumors. A staff girl who's grown a little too important in Mr. Dawson's eyes. Is that you?" Her pulse hammered. "Excuse me," she murmured, attempting to brush by. He placed a firm hand on her arm, stopping her progress. "Hear me out," he said, voice calm but laced with threat. "Richard Dawson is on the cusp of either securing everything or losing it all. The last thing he needs is a scandal with an employee. And you look like someone with a secret." Keisha yanked her arm away, eyes flashing. "Let go," she said, a tremor betraying her anger and alarm. She loathed the way he peered at her like a specimen under a microscope. His gaze dropped to her abdomen, and in that split second, she knew he sensed the truth. "I see," he said softly, a perverse satisfaction twisting his features. "It's not just gossip. You're pregnant, aren't you?" Blood roared in her ears. She wanted to deny it, to run, but words failed her. Her silence was enough of a confession. Winston took a step back, crossing his arms. "Well, that changes things," he murmured. "Dawson never mentioned it. Perhaps he doesn't know. This is a big inconvenience for him, one that will cost him dearly." Keisha's voice finally emerged. "This is none of your business," she said, a crack of desperation in her tone. "On the contrary," Winston replied, "Richard's future is very much my business, and so by extension you are too." With unnerving composure, he removed a sleek checkbook from his inner jacket pocket. "I can help you," he said, as though offering a kindly service. "You take some money, disappear, have the baby or babies, or do whatever you need, and in return, you never breathe a word of Richard's involvement. You vanish from his life so he can move on without scandal." Her stomach lurched at the blunt cruelty of the offer. She stared at the checkbook as if it were a coiled snake. "I'm not for sale," she said, voice unsteady with fury and pain. Winston gave a small shrug. "Maybe not, but I bet you need money." His words struck a raw nerve. Her grandparents, the medical bills, her precarious existence. "Think of it as a kindness, Ms. Keisha. Whatever you call it, it solves everyone's problems." Tears threatened, but she forced them back. "You don't know anything about me." He tilted his head. "I know you're wearing a uniform in this house instead of a designer dress. I know you're pregnant and alone, and I know that if you stay here, you'll ruin any hope Richard has left of saving his legacy." She felt a crushing sense of shame, as if he'd stripped her of every last bit of dignity. Her secret, the children's existence, had become a cheap bargaining tool in Winston's hands. And Richard, he was still inside that office, perhaps oblivious to the confrontation unfolding in the corridor. Winston scribbled a figure on a check, tore it free, and held it out. "This is more than generous," he said. "Take it, and don't return. I'll consider it a quiet arrangement. No one will know you had anything to do with Richard Dawson." Fury and heartbreak clashed in her chest. She slapped the check aside, letting it flutter to the marble floor. "I won't do this," she whispered, voice hoarse. "I won't let you buy me off." Winston's eyes narrowed. "Then do you want to destroy him?" he asked coldly. "Because that's what will happen. If you stay, if you continue this, whatever you think it is, Richard's entire empire crumbles under the scandal. His family will disown him, and the investors will bury him. He's worked all his life to build up the Dawson name. Is that what you want?" She wavered, agony knotting her stomach. Everything Winston said hammered her deepest fears. Could she really watch Richard lose everything because of her secret? She hated Winston's manipulative tone, but hated even more how much power it held. Winston stooped to pick up the check. "This is your chance to do something right for him," he said softly now, the mask of threat sliding into faux concern. "He doesn't need to know. You can slip away, avoid the humiliation for both of you. No one will blame you for wanting a better life outside this complicated situation." Before she could reply, the office door opened again. She jerked around, expecting Richard to emerge, but it was Mr. Harris, the butler, who stepped out, looking weary. "Miss Keisha," he said, oblivious to the tension in the hallway. "Mr. Dawson is about to leave for an urgent appointment." Winston smoothly tucked the check into his pocket, giving her a meaningful look. "Think it over," he whispered, then inclined his head at the butler. "I was just on my way out." Keisha stood there trembling as Winston brushed past Mr. Harris and disappeared down the hall, footsteps echoing with finality. She remained still, heart pounding. After a moment, she realized Mr. Harris was eyeing her with mild concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. She forced a nod, slipping away without another word. Her entire body shook as she headed toward the back stairs, trying to outrun the horrifying scenario Winston had painted. She clung to the rail, her legs weak. The fear and shame Winston inflicted felt suffocating, a coil tightening around her every step. When she reached her small bedroom, she locked the door, leaning against it with tears finally spilling over. She heard faint chatter from elsewhere in the mansion, the staff moving through daily routines, oblivious to her internal collapse. A violent swirl of questions battered her. Could she possibly confront Richard now, after hearing Winston's threats? Would he believe her or see it as a trap? She thought of how desperately he'd tried to secure his deals, how his family pressured him to marry a socially suitable partner. And now, triplets. Her gaze fell on a lined piece of notepaper on the bedside table. She sat down, letting her tears blot the first words she wrote. "Richard, I'm sorry." She poured out her heart onto the page, admitting she had to leave, that she couldn't burden him with her complications. She couldn't bring herself to write the truth about her pregnancy, terrified it would only add to his troubles. Instead, she vaguely mentioned that she needed to protect him from scandal, and that their worlds weren't meant to collide. By the time she finished, the note was messy with tear stains, but it captured her raw anguish. She folded it, pressing it to her chest in a silent farewell. Then she hurriedly stuffed a few belongings into a small duffel bag, her thoughts pounding with urgency. Winston's check flashed through her mind, and a bitter laugh escaped her. She had no intention of taking his money, yet she had to leave all the same. A short while later, under the dusk sky, Keisha slipped out of the servants' entrance. The cool air hit her cheeks, and the hush of evening enveloped her as she crossed the wide lawn behind the mansion. With each step, her heart clenched. Would Richard even know she was gone before it was too late? She pictured his confusion, maybe even anger, but she held on to the conviction that leaving was the only way to shield him from a ruinous scandal, and to shield her children from growing up in a world that saw them as pawns. She reached the gates, pausing one last time to look back at the silhouette of the Dawson mansion, lights glowing in the windows. Part of her yearned to run back inside, to tell him everything, to ask if they could face it together. But Winston's voice echoed in her mind. "You'll ruin him." And she steeled herself, turning away from the place she'd begun to think of as a complicated, painful home. When the night breeze stirred, she clutched her duffel tight and walked down the road. Far behind her, a swirl of phone calls and unanswered questions would soon reveal her absence. But by then, she hoped to be far enough away that no one would find her, at least for a while. Hours later, Richard returned to the mansion, weary from the urgent appointment Winston had forced upon him. As soon as he stepped into the foyer, he sensed something was amiss. The staff shuffled around, hushed, sharing uncertain looks. Before he could ask, Mrs. Bancroft rushed forward, pressing a folded note into his hand. "She left this for you," she said gravely. His pulse leapt. "Who?" he demanded, though dread already told him the answer. Unfolding the note, he scanned Keisha's tear-stained words, his face losing all color. He looked up, heart pounding. "When did she leave?" he asked, voice taut. No one could answer. Fear flared in his eyes. She was gone. Why? Did it have to do with the pregnancy, or was it something else? He tore down the corridor to her room, finding it empty, belongings cleared out. Pain and confusion warred inside him. He had no idea where she might have gone, nor how to bring her back. And then his phone buzzed. He answered mechanically, hardly registering the voice on the other end, until the caller mentioned a boarding house near the city outskirts, where someone matching Keisha's description had been spotted. His heart surged with a flicker of hope. If she was still in reach, perhaps he wasn't too late. Richard receives a tip about Keisha's possible location. Feeling a surge of hope, he grabs his coat and rushes out, determined to bring her back. The neighborhood was a tangle of narrow streets and weathered facades, far removed from the elegant glow of the Dawson mansion. Richard maneuvered his car down a cramped lane, guided by the shaky directions he'd gotten through the cryptic tip. His heart hammered. He had spent half the night scouring addresses on the outskirts of the city, refusing to rest until he found Keisha. The tension coiled inside him like a spring, each wrong turn driving his desperation higher. At last, he spotted a small sign, half hidden by overgrown vines, "For rent." The faded letters marked a cramped boarding house with chipped paint and a squeaky metal gate. Richard killed the engine and stepped out. The evening air clung to him, thick, humid, carrying the faint odors of fried food and exhaust fumes. He glanced around, taking in the sagging porches and dimly lit windows. It felt worlds away from the mansion's polished floors and impeccable lawns. He knocked on the splintered front door, rattling it in its frame. For an agonizing moment, only silence answered. Then, footsteps. A middle-aged woman with a tired face cracked the door open, blinking skeptically at his tailored jacket and expensive watch. "Do you have a tenant named Keisha?" Richard asked, voice taut with urgency. "I heard she might be staying here." The woman frowned, clearly wary of strangers. "Depends who's asking." Richard swallowed. Time felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "My name is Richard Dawson. I'm looking for her. It's extremely important." She studied him, likely weighing whether he was dangerous or telling the truth. "Come in," she said grudgingly, stepping aside. "But keep your voice down. People here are trying to sleep." The narrow corridor reeked of mildew. The woman led him past 2 small rooms, eventually stopping near a door at the far end. Her voice lowered. "She's in there. Said she only needed a room for a few weeks, maybe less." Relief surged through him, tempered by dread. He raised a hand to knock, only to hesitate, recalling the note she'd left behind. Why had she run? Was she too afraid to face him? Easing a breath, he gave a soft rap on the door. When no answer came, he knocked again, gently calling her name. At last, the door opened a crack, and Keisha appeared, eyes widening. She wore a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair pulled back in a hastily tied scarf. The shadows under her eyes told him she wasn't sleeping any better than he was. For a moment, neither spoke. Richard's relief flooded him, seeing her alive and, he hoped, safe. Then her expression hardened, as though she'd expected he might show up. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, glancing at the landlady hovering at the end of the hallway. He tried to calm his breathing. "I came for you," he said. "You left without saying anything except—" His words caught in his throat. The memory of that tear-stained letter still stung. She ushered him inside and closed the door softly, swallowing hard. The tiny room smelled faintly of stale air and cheap cleaning fluid. A small bed and a wooden chair left barely enough space to turn around. Richard's gaze swept over a half-packed duffel bag in the corner, next to a handful of personal belongings. It was as though she hadn't planned on staying here long. A surge of protectiveness welled up in him. No way could she remain in this cramped, lonely place. "I had to go," Keisha said, wringing her hands. "Everything was spinning out of control. The investors, your family, that man Winston." Richard's jaw tightened. "He cornered you, didn't he? Tried to pay you off to leave." Her silence was confirmation enough. Anger flared in his chest. "He has no right to dictate my life," he said. "Or yours." She dropped onto the edge of the bed, shoulders sagging. "Richard, it's not just about Winston. If I stayed, you'd be ruined. This scandal would sink you. I can't let your family lose everything." Richard's expression softened. He knelt beside her, gently taking her hands. "Listen to me. That's not your decision to make alone." His voice shook. "Don't you think I'd rather risk my finances than lose you?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "It's not just about money. You don't understand yet." She trailed off, hand drifting to her stomach before she could stop herself. In that moment, the final puzzle piece clicked into place. Richard's gaze darted down, noticing her hesitant gesture. "Keisha," he breathed, "are you—" She didn't move, but the look on her face spoke volumes. The magnitude of it struck him with sudden force. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to hers. "How long have you known?" Tears slipped down her cheeks. "A while. I was too afraid to tell you. And it's not just one baby, Richard, it's 3. I found out at the clinic. Triplets." Her voice cracked on the word. "I knew it would change everything. I thought running away was the only way to protect you from the backlash." A flood of emotion swept over him. Shock, awe, a fierce wave of love. He sank onto the chair, staring at her with wide eyes. "Triplets," he repeated, as if trying to wrap his mind around it. "God, Keisha." He hesitated, seeing the fear in her face, and he reached for her hand. It's huge, but it doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Please don't shut me out." She wiped her eyes. I can't bear the thought of being blamed for taking your money, or I've heard the rumors." He shook his head. "Rumors are just noise. You and I know the truth. The rest of them can think what they like." A pause. "We'll figure it out, no matter how crazy this seems." Keisha let out a trembling breath. the weight of her secret finally out in the open. She studied Richard's face, searching for doubt, fear, maybe regret. Instead, she found unwavering resolve. It made her want to believe him, despite the risk to everything he'd built. "Your contracts, your family," she whispered. "They want you to marry someone from high society, someone who won't upset the investors." His gaze darkened. "I'm done letting them dictate my life. Yes, there will be consequences, but I'm not abandoning my child, our children." A shaky smile quirked at his lips, as though the reality of triplets was still sinking in. "Keisha, I promise I'll stand by you. If that means I lose the investors, so be it." She squeezed his hand, relief and anxiety mingling in her chest. "Richard, there's more." Her voice wavered. "My grandparents are still ill. I have to keep sending them what money I can. Without a job at the mansion, I don't know how—" He silenced her with a gentle nod, compassion flickering across his features. "We'll take care of them too," he said simply. "I have enough resources to help, and it's the least I can do." The quiet sincerity in his voice dissolved the final barriers around her heart. Tears welled up again, but this time they tasted of hope. She let out a laugh that quivered with emotion, and Richard pulled her into his arms, holding her in a tender, protective embrace. For a few moments, they just breathed each other in, no words needed. When they finally drew apart, relief coursed through Keisha's weary soul, but a gnawing worry remained. "Winston won't just give up," she murmured. "And Charlotte, she'll stir up trouble. Maybe your whole family will." Richard helped her stand. "Then let them. I won't hide you, or our children, from anyone." There was steel in his voice. "I'd rather face their anger than spend my life dancing to their demands." As if on cue, the door creaked, and the landlady's face appeared again, an apologetic frown tugging at her mouth. "Sorry, but I can't have all this commotion in the hallway, and if you plan on taking her somewhere, do it quick, or she'll need to pay for another night." Keisha exhaled, glancing around the dreary room. She had little in the way of belongings, just a few clothes and toiletries. She couldn't deny the relief that came at the thought of leaving this cramped place. She looked at Richard with questioning eyes. "I came here to bring you back," he said softly. "If you're willing." Nerves fluttered in her stomach. Going back meant confronting Winston, the investors, the stifling world of Dawson obligations. But she felt something else, a tremor of courage, bolstered by Richard's presence. If he was truly ready to fight for them, maybe they had a chance. She nodded, then bent to gather her belongings, her hands still trembling slightly. Within minutes, she'd shouldered her duffel bag. Richard slipped an arm around her shoulders, guiding her gently into the hallway. As they passed the landlady, he paused to settle the balance for Keisha's short stay. The woman gave them a curt nod of approval, though curiosity still danced in her eyes. Outside, the air was cool against Keisha's flushed cheeks, night having fully fallen over the cramped streets. Richard led her to his car, opening the passenger door as though she were the most precious thing in the world. She caught her reflection in the side mirror, a bit ragged, eyes red, but a glimmer of hope shone there. He slid behind the wheel and started the engine. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Richard reached over, taking her hand and pressing it to his lips. "Thank you," he said, voice quiet, "for trusting me." She managed a smile, resting her free hand on her stomach, the silent promise of 3 tiny lives nested within. "We'll do this together," she replied, trying to steady her voice despite the flutter of nerves. They set off, the headlights cutting through darkened streets. While the thought of returning to the mansion churned Keisha's anxiety, what if Winston was waiting for them? She found reassurance in Richard's calm determination. She glanced sideways at his profile as he drove, seeing the faint muscle working in his jaw, the flicker of headlights reflecting in his eyes. They spoke little on the ride back, but Keisha sensed the weight of the unspoken vow between them. Whatever conflict lay ahead, contracts threatened, family enraged, The endless judgments of high society, they would face it side by side. She rested her head against the seat, eyelids heavy from exhaustion and relief, her thoughts drifting to a future she hadn't dared imagine. Richard discovers the parade of obstacles that still threaten them, but he feels resolved. This time, he won't let Keisha slip away without a fight. Yet, as they near the mansion, both wonder if his circle of adversaries has grown too large to repel. As they drive away, Richard finally answers a call from his furious father, who demands an explanation. Richard ends the call by declaring he has chosen Keisha and the babies, no matter the cost. Richard guided the car through the tall iron gates of the Dawson mansion, Keisha at his side. The evening sky glowed with a soft purple hue, and the grandeur of the estate loomed ahead like a familiar yet daunting presence. She braced herself for what lay inside. After everything they had endured, returning to these polished halls felt at once like homecoming and battlefield. But Richard's hand on hers steadied her nerves. If they faced one final onslaught, they would do it together. They parked near the main entrance, stepping out into the glow of the ornate lamps that flanked the driveway. Their footsteps echoed on the pristine marble steps leading up to the front door, each stride laced with determination. At the threshold, the door was pulled open by a wide-eyed junior maid who froze at the sight of Keisha, like she was a ghost returned to life. Richard acknowledged her with a curt but polite nod, continuing inside. The hush that settled in the foyer was immediate and palpable. A handful of staff hovered by the grand staircase, eyes darting between Richard and Keisha, uncertain how to react after her sudden departure. The butler, Mr. Harris, approached, clearing his throat. For a moment, no words came. His usually stiff composure seemed to waver at Keisha's appearance, as though guilt and relief warred inside him. "Welcome back," he finally managed, voice subdued. "There have been developments while you were away." Before Richard could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the upper landing. A knot of his relatives appeared, a stern-faced uncle, a flustered aunt, and another distant cousin whose name Keisha barely remembered. They looked from Richard to Keisha, their expressions an almost comical blend of shock and disapproval. "What is the meaning of this?" his uncle demanded. "We heard you'd gone after that." He trailed off, clearly deciding it would be unwise to finish with an insult. Richard slipped an arm around Keisha's waist, drawing her close. "I've chosen to stand by her," he said, voice calm but forceful. "Whatever complaints you have, you'll direct them at me." His aunt clicked her tongue in exasperation. "Richard, you can't just ignore your obligations. We've invested so much time working toward your proper engagement, and now you bring her back?" She glanced at Keisha, eyes flicking to the faint curve of her abdomen. The suspicion in that look cut like a blade. Yet Keisha lifted her chin, refusing to cower. "I won't debate it," Richard replied, guiding Keisha toward the large sitting room. "I'm staying with her, and we're starting a family. If that upsets our so-called plans, then so be it." His words seemed to detonate a fresh wave of muttering from the relatives. But as they moved to block his path, Richard's father strode in from another corridor, posture rigid. With a single gesture, he silenced the rest of the family. Tension practically vibrated in the air. "You've made your choice, Richard," his father said, voice gruff. His sharp eyes flicked to Keisha. "The question is whether you're prepared for the consequences." His tone suggested he still doubted her, or at least the wisdom of Richard's decision. Richard squared his shoulders. "Yes, I am." Even as the air crackled with disagreement, no one dared challenge him outright. For a moment it looked like his father might bark out a condemnation. But something in Richard's firm stance seemed to take the wind out of the older man's sails. Instead, he simply stepped aside as if to say, "Go on, do as you will." The hush followed them into the sitting room where, to Keisha's surprise, a cluster of investors waited. No doubt Winston's final attempt to stage an intervention. Richard's presence, however, changed the energy in the room in an instant. The men and women in suits rose from the tufted chairs, bracing for a confrontation. Winston himself hovered near the fireplace, arms crossed, a faint sneer curling his lips when he spotted Keisha by Richard's side. "Dawson," one of the investors began, "we need to talk about your plans. There's a great deal on the line and—" "I know exactly what's on the line," Richard interrupted. He gestured for Keisha to stand with him. "But I will not be threatened or manipulated into turning my back on her. If anyone feels this choice jeopardizes their contract, they're free to walk away. I won't change my mind." A heavy silence fell. Winston's eyes flicked between Richard and Keisha, clearly furious that his leverage had slipped away. Some of the other investors exchanged uneasy looks. Then an older woman, Ms. Bradford, cleared her throat delicately. "Richard, your personal choices are your own, though we had concerns about optics. If you're truly set on this, the board may need reassurances about the stability of your household." "That's understandable," Richard replied, voice firm yet respectful. "I can assure you my household is stable, and my future marriage—" He glanced at Keisha, who felt her heart stutter at that hint of commitment. "Will be built on honesty, not convenience. If that isn't enough for you, I'll seek funding elsewhere." A flicker of interest passed over Ms. Bradford's face. "We've seen your track record. It's rare for you to make decisions lightly. I'm sure a proper statement to the press might calm any swirling rumors." Winston pursed his lips, looking like he'd swallowed something bitter. But a few of the other investors slowly nodded. "We'd rather maintain our ties with you than sever them," one admitted. "Let's see if we can find a workable arrangement going forward." Relief swept Keisha. The men and women gathered their things, exchanging polite goodnights. Winston lingered, glaring at her with undisguised contempt before stomping out last. When the door finally clicked shut, Richard let out a shaky breath, turning to face Keisha. In that moment, it felt like they'd climbed a mountain, only to see the horizon brightening. Mr. Harris, who had slipped into the room partway through, stepped forward. He'd been so critical in the past, but now his expression was subdued. "Ms. Keisha," he said hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. I treated you with undue suspicion. I can see now that you have Mr. Dawson's best interests at heart." He gave a short bow, the formality of it sending a small, warm rush of acceptance through her. "I misjudged you." Keisha inclined her head, touched by his sincerity. "Thank you," she replied gently. It felt surreal to see the butler humbled. Moments later, the head housekeeper, Mrs. Bancroft, appeared in the doorway. Her normally severe expression had softened. "Well," she said, "I hear congratulations are in order." Her gaze flicked to Keisha's abdomen. "I'd like to do what I can to ensure your comfort, especially during the coming months." Keisha's gratitude spilled out in a relieved smile. "I appreciate that. Thank you." In the midst of this slow mending of relationships, Mrs. Watts bustled in, carrying a tray of pastries and steaming cups of tea. "I figured tonight called for a small celebration," she declared, setting the tray down. "We might not be fancy aristocrats, but we know how to welcome a mother-to-be." She winked at Keisha, who laughed softly, blinking away the tears that threatened. The cook's warmth radiated through the room. Richard gestured for everyone to sit, though a new energy fueled them. He led Keisha to a cozy sofa beneath an old portrait of a Dawson ancestor. "You should see something," he murmured, addressing both her and the nearby staff. "In the study there's a ledger recording the original Dawson family history. It shows that my great-great-grandfather married a woman from humble origins. Their union was controversial back then, but it was the start of everything we are now." He stood, beckoning them into the dimly lit study, where the walls lined with books smelled of old leather and lingering dust. On a high shelf, Richard carefully pulled down a thick, time-worn ledger. He opened it to a yellowed page of handwritten notes. As they crowded around, Keisha read about an early Dawson who had defied societal norms to marry a village schoolteacher, an act that scandalized the upper class of the time. Keisha's breath caught at the parallel. "So your family," she said softly, glancing up at Richard, "was founded on a love like ours, against the odds?" He nodded, eyes shining. "Exactly. We rose from simpler roots, from that courage. Somewhere along the line, we forgot it." He turned to his father, who had quietly followed them. The older man stared at the ledger for a long moment, hands trembling slightly. "All these generations," his father said in a hushed tone. "I never realized. Perhaps we lost touch with what truly matters." Neither Richard nor his father spoke further, but a shared understanding passed between them. Keisha felt a warmth flood her, a hope that maybe acceptance would grow from this revelation. Later that night, the staff gathered in the dining hall for a modest feast that Mrs. Watts had prepared in record time. The tension that once dogged Keisha's every step had eased into genuine celebration. Conversation flowed, laughter erupted. Even Mr. Harris allowed himself a small, proud smile, occasionally refilling glasses. When Richard stood to speak, everyone turned expectantly. "Thank you all for bearing with us through this tumultuous time," he began, his gaze drifting to Keisha, who offered him a quiet smile of encouragement. "I've learned valuable lessons about family, tradition, and love these past months. And now, with Keisha at my side, and our future children," his voice momentarily quivered, and a ripple of good-natured chuckles spread around the room. "I want to ensure no family in need goes without support. That's why we're establishing a new charitable foundation in honor of Keisha's grandparents, focusing on medical care and community health initiatives." Keisha's hand flew to her mouth, tears brimming. She had dreamed of somehow assisting her grandparents' local community, but never imagined it would happen through a grand gesture like this. Applause and murmurs of approval filled the air. The notion that the Dawson name, born of a union once considered scandalous, would now uplift others seemed perfect. In the midst of the applause, Richard leaned in to Keisha, pressing a gentle hand to her belly. He whispered, "We'll call it the Grayson Foundation, after your grandparents. They deserve to see how far love can reach." "Thank you," she managed, laughter mingling with her tears. The staff toasted them, crystal clinking. Even some family members, despite earlier protests, raised their glasses in acceptance. While the impromptu celebration died down, Richard and Keisha slipped into a quiet corner. He touched her cheek, eyes shining with relief and devotion. "We did it," he whispered. "I never imagined I'd feel so free." She leaned into his touch. "I think we both needed to break a few rules to find each other," she said, letting out a soft laugh. "But I wouldn't change a thing." Later, amid the last bursts of conversation, a faint flutter danced in Keisha's abdomen. She stilled, eyes widening, then clasped Richard's hand. "I think one of them just kicked," she said, voice catching with a wondrous edge. Joy spread across his face as he gently placed his palm over her belly. The staff nearby observed with discreet smiles, wordless acceptance that this was a union worth celebrating. Keisha closed her eyes, marveling at how a single leap of faith had led to this moment. Not just two hearts joined, but three new lives ready to enter the world. Finally, the evening culminated in the unveiling of a plaque bearing the Grayson Foundation's mission statement. Cameras flashed, capturing Richard and Keisha standing side by side, staff around them beaming. Despite all the drama, it felt like a triumphant new beginning. Glasses were lifted high, champagne bubbling as a final toast. Richard's father, his relatives, and the mansion staff stood shoulder to shoulder. No more arguments, no more conspiracies, just a shared recognition that something extraordinary had happened here. Keisha gazed around, overwhelmed by gratitude. Not long ago, she had felt like an outsider, unseen and unvalued. Now she was about to become part of a legacy built on courage and love. With champagne glasses raised around them, Keisha smiles, tears of happiness on her cheeks, recalling how many obstacles they broke through. "Sometimes," she whispers to Richard, "we need to shatter a few glasses to find a love that endures." If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen